I have stood guard over 40 winters of state ceremony, and I have learned that the hardest thing a man in this uniform ever does is nothing at all. To stand and not move. To see and not turn the head. To feel grief crack open in your chest like spring ice on the Elder River, and to give it not 1 inch of your face. That is the discipline they teach you the first month you wear the bearskin in the service of the Royal House of Harrowgate. It is the discipline I taught 100 young men in my years as a sergeant of the household foot. And it is the discipline that one of those young men broke, in front of the whole assembled court of Eldermoor, on the gray morning we laid the High Steward to rest. I will tell you how it happened, because I was there, 3 paces from him, close enough to hear his breath catch. I am Corporal Edrin Vance no longer. They made me a sergeant after, then a sergeant major, and now I am old enough that they let me stand in the warm of the guardroom and talk to the recruits about honor. But on that morning I was Sergeant Vance of the cathedral detail, and I was the man who, by every regulation written in the black book of the household, should have stepped in and stopped him. I did not stop him. I will tell you why. The bell of Saint Aldous Cathedral began to toll at the 8th hour, 1 slow stroke for each decade the dead man had served the crown, and there were 9 strokes, and on the 9th the great west doors opened and the cold came in off the square. The whole of Eldermoor had come to mourn Lord Halric Mowbray, High Steward of the realm, the man who had served 3 sovereigns across 90 years of his life and 70 of his service, and who had been, to half the people in that nave, the only constant they had ever known. He had carried the white staff of his office under Queen Saralind, and under her mother before her, and under her grandfather before that. He had stood at the foot of 3 thrones. He had, the old story went, taught a frightened girl of 6 how to hold her chin when she was crowned, and that girl was now the queen, and she sat in the front pew that morning with her hands folded and her face very still, and she was the only one in the whole cathedral who looked as though she might understand what I was feeling, because she had loved the old man too. But I am ahead of myself. Let me set the picture so you can see it as I saw it. Saint Aldous is the oldest building in the kingdom, older than the palace, older than the royal house itself, a great vaulted barn of gray stone with pillars like a forest of trees turned to rock and windows that throw colored light down onto the flags when the sun is out. There was no sun that morning. The light came in thin and silver and pooled cold on the stone, and our breath smoked, and the cathedral was so full that they had opened the side aisles and the gallery above, and still men stood 3 deep along the back, lords and ladies of the court in their dark mourning, the ministers of the crown, the masters of the guilds, the wool men and the river men and the smiths, who do not bow to courtiers but who bowed their heads for Halric Mowbray, soldiers, servants, old women who had been girls when he was already an old man, and up the center aisle, on a black-draped bier carried on the shoulders of 6 pallbearers, came the coffin of the High Steward, with the white staff of his office laid the length of the lid and his old gray cloak folded at the foot. My detail lined the route. 8 men of the household foot in full ceremonial, the red wool tunic, the tall black bearskin, white gloves, the medals, the rifle reversed and held at the slow march. We had stood since before dawn. We had rehearsed the funeral protocol for 3 days. Every step was counted. Every halt was timed. In the household, we do not improvise at a state funeral, we execute. A funeral is a machine of grief, and we are the gears that keep it turning so that the family, and in this case the whole realm was the family, can give themselves entirely to mourning, knowing the ceremony will hold. That is the gift the guard gives at a funeral, not feeling, holding. We hold so that everyone else can break. The young man I am going to tell you about was at the head of the route, nearest the high altar where the bier would come to rest. His name was Thomas Reed. He was 22 years old. He had been 3 years in the service, and he was the best young guardsman I had trained in a decade, not the strongest, not the tallest, but the steadiest, the one whose stillness was real and not performed. You can always tell the difference. A young guard who is being still is fighting himself. You can see the fight, the locked jaw, the held breath, the eyes that want to dart. A guard who has become still is at peace inside the discipline, and Tomas Reed was at peace inside it the way few men ever get. I had told the captain so. I had said that boy will be standing at the gate the day they carry me out. I believed it. What I did not know, what almost no one in that cathedral knew, was that Tomas Reed had a reason to be there that morning that had nothing to do with the duty roster, and everything to do with the man in the coffin. But I will come to that. First, you must understand the protocol, because to understand what he did you must understand exactly what he was forbidden to do. At a state funeral of the highest rank, the household guard does not break ranks for any reason short of fire or violence. We do not turn to look at the coffin. We do not kneel. We do not salute the dead. The salute is for the living crown, and a funeral is not a crowning. We hold the slow march. We present arms at the appointed halts, and we keep our eyes forward, fixed on the middle distance on nothing, for the whole 2 hours of the rite. There is a reason for every part of it. The eyes forward keeps the guard from becoming a spectacle, from drawing the mourner's attention to ourselves and away from the dead. The no kneeling keeps the line of the realm clear. The guard serves the crown, and the crown alone kneels before God in that cathedral, in the person of the Queen. The Black Book is very plain on all of it. I had read it to Tomas Reed in his class 100 times. He could have recited it back to me in his sleep. So when I tell you that at the climax of the rite, Tomas Reed stepped out of the line, turned to face the coffin, went down on one knee on the cold stone, and did the thing he did, you will understand that he knew to the letter that he was breaking the oldest and strictest protocol of his service, in front of the Queen, in front of the court, in front of the whole watching realm, and that the punishment for it could end him. You will understand, too, that I had perhaps 2 seconds to stop him. And you will understand, before I am done, why I am glad to my bones that I did not. But let me go back to the cold dawn, and the empty cathedral, and the way it all began, because the beginning of this story is not the funeral at all. The beginning is a small thing, a thing almost no one remembers that happened years before, on a winter night at the palace gate, when an old man in a gray cloak stopped to speak to a frightened boy. I did not see that night myself. Tomas told me of it later in the guard room, the way young men tell the things that made them, and I have heard the rest of it from others who knew the High Steward, and I have stitched it together the way an old soldier stitches a thing he wishes he had witnessed. So take it as a true thing told at one remove. Tomas Reed came to Harrowgate Palace as a boy of 14, not as a guard but as the lowest of the kitchen boys, a scullion who carried coal and scrubbed the great copper pots and slept in a cot above the bakehouse where the ovens kept the cold off. He had no people. His father had been a wheelwright in a village out past the Elderwood who had died of a winter fever, and his mother had followed her husband within the year, and the boy had been sent to the palace, because a cousin of his mother's worked in the laundry and could not feed him but could speak for him to the under-steward. So at 14 he was given a coat too big for him and a bed above the ovens and a place at the bottom of the great machine of the household. And he was, by every account, a quiet, watchful, lonely child who did his work well and spoke to almost no one. There is a thing that happens to a boy who has lost everyone. He goes very still inside. He learns that the safest thing is to be small and useful and unnoticed, to give the world no handle to hurt him by. It is the same stillness, I have come to think, that makes a great guardsman. Only in a guardsman it is turned outward into duty, and in a lonely boy it is turned inward into a kind of hiding. The High Steward, who had a long eye for people, must have seen the one and known it could be turned into the other. But that is me looking back. On the night it happened, it was only an old man and a boy and the cold. It was the deep of winter, the long dark they call the weeks after the turn of the year in Eldermoor, when the sun barely clears the cathedral roof before it sinks again. The boy Tomas had been sent out across the inner court near midnight to carry a covered dish to the gatehouse. The night watch were given hot food on the bitter nights, and it was a scullion's job to run it out to them. He was crossing the wide cobbled court alone, the dish hot through his thin gloves, the wind coming off the river hard enough to lean on, and he was crying. He told me this plainly, years later, with no shame in it, because by then he was a man who had learned that there is no shame in a child's grief. He was crying because it was the anniversary of the day his mother died, and he had told no one, because there was no one to tell, and the loneliness of that, the having no one even to be sad in front of, had come down on him in the dark of the court like the cold itself. And out of the shadow of the gatehouse arch came an old man in a gray cloak, leaning on a white staff, who had been walking the night the way old men do who cannot sleep. The High Steward of the realm, Lord Halric Mowbray, 90 years old, taking the air at midnight in his own private corner of the kingdom he had served all his life. He should not have noticed a kitchen boy at all. The great do not see the small. That is nearly a law of nature in a palace. But Halric Mowbray was not like the great. He stopped and he looked at the boy and he saw the tears, and he did not pretend not to. "You are carrying the watch their supper," he said. "That is well done, but you are weeping, and a man should not weep alone in the cold. Walk with me to the gate and tell me what the matter is, or do not tell me as you please, but do not be alone with it." And the boy, who had been alone with everything for 2 years, walked with the old man to the gate, and somewhere in the crossing of that cold court he told him about his mother, about the day, about the having no one. And the High Steward listened. He did not fix it. There was nothing to fix. He only listened, and when they reached the gatehouse he saw the watch fed, and then he sat the boy down on the bench by the brazier where the guards warmed themselves, and he talked to him. He told him, Thomas said, that grief was not a thing you got over but a thing you learned to carry, the way a soldier learns to carry his pack until the weight becomes a part of his own back. He told him that the people we lose do not leave us so much as they go quiet inside us, and that the work of a life is to keep them company in that quiet, not to forget them. And then, and this is the part Thomas told me with his voice gone rough, the old man had said, "I lost my own mother when I was younger than you, 80 years gone now. I still walk out at night sometimes and tell her how the kingdom is doing. She liked to hear how things were getting on. So you see, you are not so alone as you think. There are more of us out walking in the cold than you would guess." The High Steward had no children. He had given his whole life to the crown and kept none of it for a family of his own. That was the common story of him, told always with a kind of reverence and a kind of pity. But I have come to think the common story had it wrong. I think Halric Mowbray had a great many children in a way. I think he gathered them up one at a time, all his long life, the frightened scullions and the lost pages and the green young clerks, and he gave each of them a piece of what a father gives, and then he sent them on into the great machine of the palace to grow. Thomas Reed was one of those children. He was the last one, perhaps. And he never forgot the night the High Steward walked him across the cold court and told him he was not so alone as he thought. That was the small thing that the whole great thing grew out of. An old man and a boy and a covered dish going cold in the wind. Hold it in your mind, because everything that happened in the cathedral, every protocol broken and every breath held in that great gray nave, runs straight back to that midnight crossing of the inner court. Now let me bring you back to the cold dawn of the funeral, and the empty cathedral, and the hours before the doors opened, because that is where I come into it, and where I first saw, without yet understanding it, what the day was going to cost the young man under my command. We mustered in the dark, an hour before dawn, in the muster yard behind the cathedral close, our breath hanging white under the lamps. A state funeral of the highest rank takes a detail of more than 30 men of the household foot, and on that morning the captain himself, Captain Ansel Greer, stood the inspection, which he did not always do. He went down the line with the inspecting lantern held close, checking every button, every medal, the set of every bearskin, the white of every glove, and he said almost nothing, because there was nothing to say. The men were perfect. They were perfect because they knew whose funeral it was. There is a thing you can feel in a detail when the men care about the duty, and not merely about getting through it. And I felt it that morning down the whole line. A kind of weight, a seriousness, the air a man's breath takes on when he is doing something that matters to him. Lord Mowbray had been good to the Guard across 70 years. He had stood up for us in council more than once when the ministers wanted to cut our number or take away our old privileges. The old men in the regiment spoke of him the way you speak of a grandfather, and the young men had grown up on those stories. So the line was perfect, and it was perfect out of love, and Captain Greer knew it, and he let the silence do the saying. I was at the right of the line, and Tomas Reed was 4 men down from me, and when the lantern came to him I looked at his face, because it is a sergeant's habit to look at his men's faces, and I saw something I did not like. He was pale, not the ordinary pale of a cold dawn, paler than that, a gray, fixed pallor, and his eyes had the look I have seen on men the night before a battle and on men who have not slept. He was perfectly still, perfectly turned out, his bearing flawless. To Captain Greer going down the line, he looked like every other man, like discipline made flesh. But I had trained him. I had stood beside him at 100 duties. And I could see, the way you can see weather coming over the moor before anyone else feels it, that something was wrong with Tomas Reed, something pressing on him hard from the inside. I said nothing in the line. You do not. But when the inspection was done and the captain had gone to confer with the cathedral wardens, and the men had a few minutes to stamp the cold out of their feet before we marched in, I stepped down the line to where Tomas stood and I spoke to him low. "You look like a ghost, Reed," I said. "Are you sick? If you are sick, tell me now and I will stand you down, and there's no shame in it. A man on a long ceremony who's going to faint is no use to the dead or the living. Tell me true." He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he was going to tell me whatever it was that had pressed the color out of his face. His mouth opened. Then it closed, and he looked forward again, and he said, "I'm not sick, Sergeant. I'll hold the duty. I want to hold this duty. There's no other duty in the world I'd rather hold than this one." There was something in the way he said it, not the words. The words were proper, but the underthing in the voice, that should have warned me. I have gone over it 1,000 times since. If I had been wiser, if I had been less tired, if I had not been carrying my own grief that morning, and using all my discipline to carry it, I would have heard it. I would have heard a man telling me, in the only way he could, that he had decided something, and that nothing I said was going to move him from it. But I did not hear it. I heard a steady young guardsman saying he would hold his post, which is what I most wanted to hear, and I clapped him once on the shoulder, a thing I rarely did, the touch a kind of permission to grieve that I could not put in words, and I said, "Good man. We carry the old lord home today. Eyes forward, hold the line, let the realm break, we hold." Which is the thing I had said to 100 details before 100 funerals, the small liturgy of our trade. And he said very quietly, so quietly I almost missed it, "We hold so that everyone else can break. I remember, Sergeant. I've always remembered. I remember the words now because of everything that came after. At the time they were only a good young soldier giving back the lesson, and I was warmed by it. And I went back to my place at the head of the line, and the bell began its slow 9 strokes, and we marched in. We marched in under the great west doors as the first gray light came down the windows, 30 and more of us in 2 files up the long center aisle, the slow march, the rifles reversed, the only sound the strike of our heels on the worn flags and the deep first notes of the organ taking up the lament. The cathedral was already filling. The court was taking its places. And up at the high altar, on the black-draped catafalque, the place stood empty and waiting where the coffin of the High Steward would soon come to rest, between the tall, unlit candles, under the old carved roof, where the stone angels have watched over 700 years of the kingdom's grief. We took our positions. Tomas Reed took his, nearest the altar, on the right of the catafalque, the post of honor, the post I had given him myself because he was the best young guardsman in the detail, and because, God forgive me, I did not know. It placed him 3 steps from the coffin of the one man in the world he had most loved. The doors at the back boomed open one last time. The bell fell silent. And down the long aisle, on the shoulders of 6 pallbearers, with the white staff laid the length of the lid and the old grey cloak folded at the foot, came Lord Halric Mowbray, High Steward of the realm, home to his rest. I fixed my eyes forward on the middle distance on nothing, as the black book commands, and out of the corner of my eye, where I should have seen nothing, I saw the young man on the right of the catafalque begin, very slightly, to tremble. It was the smallest thing. A man who did not know him, a man who had not spent 3 years teaching him to be still, would never have caught it. The tremble was not in his hands. His hands were locked white-gloved on the reversed rifle, perfectly correct, and it was not in his face, which stayed forward and fixed. It was deeper than that. It was the tremble that comes up through the boots from the floor of a man, the fine high shiver of a body holding a thing too large for it, the way a bridge will tremble under a weight near the limit of what it can bear. I had felt it in my own legs that morning more than once. I felt it then, and I knew it for what it was because I was feeling the same flood and damming it the same way. Grief, held back by main force, looking for any crack to come through. The pallbearers brought the coffin up the last of the aisle and set it on the catafalque between the tall candles, and the candles were lit, and the cathedral, which had been murmuring and rustling with the great crowd settling, went silent, truly silent, the deep silence of hundreds of people all holding the same breath at once. The Dean of Saint Aldous, a stooped old man near as ancient as the dead one, came forward in his black and silver vestments and stood at the head of the coffin, and he lifted his hands, and the rite of the burial of a great servant of the crown began. I will not give you all of it. It is 2 hours long, and most of it is the slow grand machinery of a state funeral, the readings, the long prayers in the old tongue, the singing of the cathedral choir up in the high gallery, the procession of the great officers of the realm to lay their tokens on the coffin. I stood through it as I have stood through 40 of its kind, eyes forward, mind held still, the discipline doing its quiet work of keeping me a gear in the machine and not a man with a heart. And I watched Thomas Reed with the edge of my eye hold his post and hold his grief, and I was, I confess it, proud of him. He was trembling, but he was holding. That is all we ask. That is all the duty is. You may shake, you may not break. The first hour passed that way. The dean read the long roll of the High Steward's offices and honors, which took a quarter of an hour by itself. 90 years of service spoken out in the old man's cracked voice into the silence keeper of the Privy Seal, warden of the marches in his middle years, Lord Chamberlain, and at the last and longest High Steward of the realm, the office he had held for 40 years, the high office of the crown that is half a servant's and half a king's. The roll of it filled the cathedral. You could feel the crowd, hearing it, beginning to understand the size of the man they had lost, not the kindly old figure with the white staff they all knew by sight, but the great pillar of the kingdom, the man who had quietly held the realm steady through a regency, through a bad harvest year that nearly broke the river towns, through the death of a king and the long minority of a queen. Half the people in that cathedral owed the peace of their whole lives, without ever knowing it, to the steady hand of the man in that coffin. The roll of his offices told them so, and you could hear the silence change as they took it in, going from the silence of mourning, a familiar face, to the deeper silence of mourning, a thing you did not know you had until it was gone. And through all of it, Queen Saralyn sat in the front pew with her 2 children beside her, Prince Joran, 10 years old, in his small dark coat, sitting very straight and very serious the way a boy will when he is determined to be a man for an afternoon, and Princess Maylin, only 8, who did not yet have the discipline to sit still through 2 hours, and who kept turning her small face up to her mother, not from boredom, but from a child's bewilderment at all the grief around her, a child trying to understand why the grown people were so sad. The queen sat between them with a hand on each, and she did not weep, because a queen does not weep in public, But I saw her face when the roll of honors was read, and I saw what it cost her to keep it still, and I understood that she was doing the same work I was doing, the same work Thomas Reed was doing, holding, so that the right could go on. The Prince Consort, Aldric, sat at the Queen's other side, his face grave. And behind the royal family, in the great pews of the court, sat the lords and ministers and grandees of Eldermoor, and among them I marked him, because a guardsman marks the room out of long habit even at a funeral, sat a man I will have to tell you about, because he becomes part of this story whether I wish it or not. His name was Lord Corwin Hale, and he was the Earl Marshal of the realm, the great officer whose office it is to govern all matters of state ceremony, the keeper of the protocols, the man whose word is law in the cathedral that day on every question of how a thing is to be done. He was a younger man than most of the great officers, perhaps 50, with a hard, clean-shaven face and an eye that went everywhere. And he sat that morning in the pew nearest the catafalque with the look of a man who has organized a great machine and is watching to see that every gear turns as he has set it. He was a man who loved the protocols not, I think, because he loved the things they served, but because he loved the order itself, the clean perfection of a thing done exactly to the book. There are such men in every great institution. They are not bad men. The kingdom needs them, but God help the gear that slips its tooth where Lord Corwin Hale can see it. I tell you about him now so that you will understand, when the moment came, exactly who was watching, and exactly what kind of man held in his hand the power to destroy Thomas Reed where he knelt. The second hour began. The choir sang the old lament, the one they sing only for the burial of the highest servants of the crown, the slow falling melody that is older than the cathedral itself, and the sound of it came down from the high gallery and filled the great stone forest of the nave, and I felt my own throat close. It is a terrible thing, that song. It is built to break you. And I held, and the court held, and the Queen held, and Thomas Reed, 3 steps from the coffin, held, but I saw the tremble in him grow, saw it climb up out of the floor and into his shoulders, saw the white-gloved hands tighten on the rifle until I thought the wood might crack. And then came the part of the right that I had not let myself think about, the part that I should have known would be the breaking point, the part that I have since come to believe Thomas Reed had been waiting for since the cold dawn, since perhaps the moment he heard the High Steward was dead. The eulogy. By the custom of Eldermoor, the eulogy at the funeral of a High Steward is given by the sovereign. Not by a churchman, not by a kinsman, by the crown itself, because the High Steward belongs to the crown above all, and the crown must speak for him. So when the choir's lament fell at last to silence, Queen Saralind rose from the front pew, and she walked to the lectern at the head of the coffin, and she stood there in her dark mourning with the cold silver light coming down on her, and she spoke for the dead. I will not try to give you the whole of what she said, because I could not do it justice, and because half of it was the proper grand language of a state eulogy, the offices recounted, the services praised, the realm's gratitude declared. But there was a part in the middle of it, a part where she left the grand language behind, and it is that part you must hear. He taught me to be a queen, she said, and her voice, which had been steady, went down very low, and the whole cathedral leaned toward it. I was 6 years old when my grandfather died, and I was crowned, and I was terrified. I have never told this to anyone. I was 6, and they put a crown on my head that was too heavy for my neck, and I had to sit on a throne in front of the whole court, and I was so frightened I thought I would be sick. And there was an old man standing beside the throne. He was already old then. I think he was always old. I cannot imagine him young, and when no one else was looking, he leaned down to me and he said, "Lift your chin, little one. Not for them, for yourself. A frightened queen who lifts her chin is braver than a king who was never afraid. Lift your chin, and I will stand here, and you will not fall." And I lifted my chin, the Queen said, and he stood there. For 40 years he stood there. Every frightened moment of my reign, every council where I did not know what to do, Every dark hour of the Regency when I was a child queen and the kingdom hung in the balance, I would look, and there would be the old man with the white staff, standing just where I could see him, and I would lift my chin and I would not fall. He never let me fall, not once in 40 years. They will tell you he had no children, the Queen said, and now her voice did break, just slightly, just for a word, and she let it, and the breaking of it went through the cathedral like a struck bell. They will tell you he gave his whole life to the crown and kept nothing for himself, but I tell you he had children. I was his child, and I was not the only one. There is not a frightened young thing who passed through this palace in 70 years that he did not stop for and steady and send on stronger than he found them. He gathered up the lost ones. He made them his. That was his secret life, the one the histories will not record. He was a father to the fatherless of this house, all of them, all his long life, and he asked for nothing back, and most of them never even knew what they had until. She stopped, she gathered herself, she lifted her own chin exactly the way the old man must have taught her, and she finished, until today, when we lay him down and find out all at once how much of what held us up was him. And in the silence after that, 3 steps from the coffin, on the right of the catafalque, in the post of honor that I had given him myself, Tomas Reed made a sound. It was very small. It was the sound a man makes when grief gets past the gate of his throat for half a second before he can shut it again. Not a sob, not a cry, just a single broken intake of breath, the smallest possible breach in the dam. In an ordinary place it would have been nothing. In the deep silence of that cathedral, 3 steps from the Queen at the lectern, it carried. The Queen heard it. I saw her eyes flick just once toward the young guardsman, and then away with the discipline of a lifetime. The Earl Marshal, Lord Corwin Hale, in the pew nearest the catafalque, heard it, and his hard, clean face turned, slow and cold, toward the source of the breach in his perfect right, and fixed on Tomas Reed and stayed there. And I, the boy's sergeant, 3 paces off, fixed my eyes harder forward and felt my own heart slam against my ribs, because I knew the way you know a stone is going to fall once it has begun to slide, that Tomas Reed was very close to the edge of something, and that I could not reach him, and that I did not know what was on the other side of it. Let me tell you here, in this held breath of a moment, why I understood him so well. Why I, of all the men in that cathedral, knew exactly what flood was rising in that young man, and exactly how thin the dam had grown. It is because I had stood in a cathedral once myself, in this very uniform, 3 steps from a coffin I loved, and held, and it had nearly killed me to do it. It was my own sergeant, the man who trained me, 40 years gone, the way I trained Tomas Reed. Sergeant Brand, his name was. He took me into the household when I was a wild and angry boy with no more prospects than a thrown stone, and he made a guardsman of me, and more than that, he made a man of me, with a hard hand and a fair one and a patience I did not deserve. He was my father in every way that matters. My own father I never knew. And when he died, old in his bed, full of years, a good death, they gave him a guardsman's funeral, and I stood the detail, because I would not have let another man stand it. And I held my post 3 steps from his coffin through the whole right, eyes forward, not a muscle moving, while everything in me screamed to turn and kneel and say goodbye to the man who had saved my life. I did my duty. I did not break the protocol, and I have regretted it every day of the 40 years since. That is the thing no one tells you about the discipline. The discipline is right nearly always. The holding is the gift nearly always. But there is a cost to it that you do not see until it is too late to pay any other price, and the cost is this. Sometimes the duty stands between you and the last thing you will ever be able to say to someone you love, and you choose the duty, because that is who you have made yourself, and then the someone is in the ground and the moment is gone forever, and you find out that there are some kinds of holding that a man should not do, that there is a love that outranks the protocol, and that the Black Book, for all its wisdom, does not have a page for that. I had learned that lesson too late, over my own sergeant's grave, and carried it 40 years. And now I stood 3 paces from a young man I loved like the son I never had, and I watched him come to the same brink I had come to, the brink where the duty and the love pull a man in half. And I did not yet know which way he would go, but I knew, God help me, which way I hoped he would go. I should tell you, too, what was happening beyond the great west doors in the square and the streets, because it bears on the size of the thing and on why the mourning carried the weight it did. The cathedral held some 2,000 souls, the court and the great and the chosen of the guilds, and it was full to the galleries. But outside, in the cold of the square and down every street that led to it, stood the realm. They had come from the river towns and the border hills and the wool country and the fishing coasts, come on foot and on carts, and on the slow barges up the ordinary people of Eldermoor who had never been inside Saint Aldous in their lives and never would be, standing shoulder to shoulder in the gray cold to be near the old man on his last morning. They could not see the right. They could only stand and wait and listen to the slow tolling of the bell and be there. I had marched in past them at dawn, and I had seen their faces, and I will tell you that I had never seen the like at any funeral I stood in 40 years. Not the curious crowd that comes to gape at a great occasion, but a grieving people, quiet, patient, many of them weeping already though the rite had not begun. Old men with their hats in their hands and young mothers holding small ones up to see the coffin pass, as you hold a child up to see a thing it must remember all its life. Why did the river men and the wool women and the hill farmers grieve an old courtier most of them had never met? I have thought about it, and I think the answer is the same answer as everything else in this story. Halric Mowbray had held the realm steady for 90 years, and the steadiness had reached down, in 10,000 quiet ways, into lives that never knew his name. The river town that did not flood the year, he diverted the crown's grain to shore the dikes. The border villages he kept out of a war no one now remembers, because he talked 3 angry lords out of it in a back room one winter. The fishing fleet that did not starve the season the catch failed, because an old man in the palace remembered them and moved the right coin to the right place before anyone else had noticed there was trouble. He had spent 90 years being the hand that steadied things from behind, the man who fixed what would have broken before most people knew it was breaking, and asked for no thanks and got little, and the realm had felt him the way you feel the floor under your feet without thinking, until it is gone. And now it was gone, and they felt it, all at once, the whole realm at the same moment feeling the floor it had stood on its whole life, and they had come in their thousands to stand in the cold and be near the man who had been their steadiness. That was the grief outside the doors. It pressed on the cathedral like weather. Every soul inside could feel the realm standing in the cold outside, waiting, and it added to the weight of the mourning a thing that is hard to name. The sense that this was not the court's funeral but the whole kingdom's, that the small rite inside the stone was carrying the grief of a nation, and that it had better be true, because the realm was listening at the door. And it was into that pressure, the weeping court within, the grieving realm without, the whole kingdom feeling the floor go out from under it, that the young guardsman at his post was holding, and trembling and beginning to break. He was not holding back his own grief alone. He was holding at the very point where all of it met, 3 steps from the coffin, the focus of the whole morning's weight, and the wonder is not that he broke but that he held as long as he did. The Queen finished her eulogy. She returned to the front pew and gathered her children to her, and the Dean came forward again for the final commendation, the last and most solemn part of the rite, where the great officers of the realm come one by one to lay their hands on the coffin and give the dead man back to God and the earth. And it was during the commendation, in the slow grand procession of lords laying their tokens on the lid of the box, that the thing happened which I have been telling you toward all this while. The commendation is a slow thing and a beautiful one, and I had always loved it before that day. The great officers of the realm come up the side of the catafalque one at a time, in the strict order of their precedence, and each lays a hand on the coffin or sets a small token upon it. A token chosen to speak some truth about the dead and the office, and bows and withdraws. It is the realm saying goodbye through its hands. The Earl Marshal governs the order of it. That is his office. And Lord Corwin Hale had governed it to perfection, the precedence exact, the timing exact, each lord coming forward at the right moment and withdrawing at the right moment, the whole grave dance turning like the works of a great clock. But a clock has no heart, and that, I think, was the whole trouble between what Lord Corwin Hale wanted from that morning, and what the morning truly was. I must tell you here a thing I did not learn until afterward, because it changes how you will see the trembling boy at his post. I had thought, all through that first hour, that Thomas Reed was simply a guardsman holding hard against a grief any of us might feel. I did not know how little sleep he had had. I did not know that he had kept the death watch. It is an old custom of Eldermoor, near forgotten now, that when a great servant of the crown lies dead, his body is watched through the nights before the burial, never left alone, a candle kept lit, a living soul kept by the coffin in the still hours, so that the dead does not lie unattended on the last passage between the house of the living and the house of God. In the old days it was done by the household, by the men and women who had served alongside the dead. By the time Lord Mowbray died, the custom had shrunk to a formality. The cathedral kept a verger by the bier through the nights, and that was thought enough. But Thomas Reed, when he heard the old lord was dead, and he heard it the way servants hear things, from a chambermaid weeping in a corridor before the court was even told, Thomas Reed went to the under-steward and asked, as a private man and not as a guardsman, whether he might keep the watch. Not the ceremonial guard detail that stood the day shifts at the lying-in state, that was rostered and official. He asked for the dead hours, the empty middle of the night, the watch no one wanted and no one would see. And he kept it. 3 nights in the cold side chapel of Saint Aldous, where the old lord lay before the funeral, Thomas Reed sat up alone with the coffin through the dead hours, off duty, unpaid, unrostered, unknown to anyone but the verger and the under-steward and later me. He did not tell me at the time. He told me years after, the way he told me everything, plainly and without weight, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world for a young man to give 3 of his nights' sleep to sit in the cold with a dead man he loved. I asked him what he did all those hours. He said, I talked to him, the way he told me to talk to my mother, out walking in the cold. I told him how the kingdom was getting on. He liked to hear how things were getting on. So I told him. I sat there and I told the old lord how the realm was doing, 3 nights running, the way he would have wanted to be told, and I do not know, but I think he was not lonely on the way out. He was not alone with it. That was all I wanted to give him. He gave me that once. I wanted to give it back. So understand, the boy who stood trembling at his post that morning had not slept properly in 3 nights. He had sat up in the cold with the coffin until his grief and his exhaustion and his love had worn the dam in him paper-thin. And then he had risen on the 4th morning and put on the red coat and the bearskin and taken the post of honor and held. That is the thing I did not know when I clapped him on the shoulder in the muster yard and told him to keep his eyes forward. I did not know he had already been keeping vigil at that coffin for 3 nights, that he had already, in the dark and alone, said most of what he would say aloud at the kneel. The kneel, when it came, was not a thing that broke loose in a moment of weakness. It was the last word of a watch he had been keeping, in secret all along. There was one other who knew of the night watches, besides the verger and the under-steward, and I will name him now because he matters later. He was a young guardsman of the detail named Wat Alney, 2 years junior to Thomas, who had idolized Thomas the way a green soldier idolizes the steady older one above him. Wat had found out about the vigils. He had come early to the cathedral one of those mornings to polish his kit in quiet, and had seen Thomas coming gray-faced out of the side chapel at dawn, and Wat had told no one, but he had understood. And on the morning of the funeral, Wat Alney stood 4 places down the line from Thomas, and Wat Alney was watching him with a fear in his eyes that I, reading the whole line, had marked and not understood. He was watching, I think, because he alone knew how thin the dam had worn, and he was afraid for the man he loved, and he could do nothing but stand his own post and watch. I tell you of Wat Alney now because when the moment came, when the kneel happened and the Earl Marshal gave his cold order, it was Wat Alney, 4 places down, who did a small brave thing of his own that I will come to, and I want you to know, when he does it, why. The lords came up one by one. The Lord Treasurer laid a single gold coin on the lid, the old token of a steward, the man who keeps the realm's purse. The Warden of the Marches laid a sprig of the grey heather that grows on the border hills the old man had once governed. The Master of the Rolls laid a scroll, and on it went the great procession of the kingdom's grandees, each token landing on the lid of the coffin with a small soft sound that, in the cathedral's silence, carried like a heartbeat. And with each one, 3 steps away on the right of the catafalque, Thomas Reed stood and trembled and held. I want you to understand how hard he was holding, because the holding is the heart of what I am telling you. It would have been easy to break. The easy thing, the thing his whole body was straining toward, was to let the grief come, to weep, to crumple, to turn and lay his own hand on the box where the man who had saved him lay. That was the flood, and it was rising, and the dam was Thomas Reed's 3 years of training and his own iron will, and I could see the strain of it in every line of him. He was not failing to feel. He was feeling more than any man in that cathedral, more even than the Queen, and he was holding it back by main force out of love for the duty, and out of, I think, a kind of terrible courtesy, a refusal to make his private grief into the public spectacle the protocol exists to prevent. He was holding because he had been taught that the guard holds so the realm can break, and he would not be the gear that slipped its tooth and stopped the great clock of the old man's last rite. And the strain of that holding was visible now even to those who did not know him. I saw the lady in the pew nearest the catafalque, an old duchess who had known the dead man, look up at the young guardsman trembling at his post, and I saw her own eyes fill, because there is nothing that breaks a watching heart like the sight of a strong man holding back grief. The crowd was beginning to feel it. The young guardsman's iron struggle, 3 steps from the coffin, was becoming part of the rite whether anyone wished it or not, a wordless eulogy in flesh. The love of the household for the old man made visible in one trembling boy in a red coat. And Lord Corwin Hale saw it too, and to him it was not beautiful. To him it was a fault in the works. I watched his hard face, and I saw him mark the young guardsman, and I saw the thing form behind his cold eyes. This man is going to break, and he is going to break in front of the Queen and the court and the realm, and he is going to make my perfect rite into a scene. And I saw the Earl Marshal turn his head very slightly, and find the eye of the captain of the detail, Captain Greer, who stood at the foot of the aisle, and I saw the small cold gesture he made, the smallest movement of 2 fingers that said as plain as words, "Remove that man." This is the midpoint of my story, and the place where the game changed. Because until that gesture, the only struggle in the cathedral was the one inside Thomas Reed, the private war between his grief and his discipline, and either way it went it would have been his own. But the moment the Earl Marshal's 2 fingers moved, it stopped being Thomas Reed's struggle alone. It became a thing that other men would decide. The machinery of the protocol, the cold, correct, well-meaning machinery that Lord Corwin Hale served, had now turned its attention on the young guardsman, and it meant to take him off his post and out of the cathedral quietly before he could disgrace it. And the captain, who must obey the Earl Marshal in all matters of the ceremony, began to move. I saw Captain Greer start up the side of the nave, slow and discreet, the way a man moves who means to reach a post without drawing the eye, and I understood that in a minute or 2 he would come up behind Thomas Reed and touch his elbow and march him off his post, and that this, being relieved at the coffin of the man he loved, led away like a man who has failed, would be a wound to Thomas Reed that would never fully heal. It would be done kindly. It would be done correctly. And it would break something in the boy that the grief alone would not have broken, because it would tell him, in the only language an institution knows, that his love was a fault to be removed. And I stood 3 paces off, and I could do nothing, because I too must obey the captain, who must obey the Earl Marshal who governs the cathedral. That is the chain. I had spent 40 years inside that chain, and I had taught Thomas Reed to honor it, and now I watched it turn against him, and I felt the old helplessness, the helplessness I had felt over my own sergeant's grave, rising in me like a tide. But I had not reckoned on 2 things. I had not reckoned on what Thomas Reed had decided in the cold dawn, and I had not reckoned on the Queen. Captain Greer came up the side of the nave with that slow, discreet step, and he reached the foot of the catafalque, and he had perhaps 10 more steps to make before he came to Thomas Reed's elbow. And in those 10 steps, 3 things happened, very close together, that I have laid out in my mind 100 times in the years since, trying to get the order of them right. The first was that Princess Maylin, the little one, 8 years old, sitting in the front pew between her mother and her brother, turned around. Children do that at funerals. They cannot hold the long stillness, and their eyes go wandering, and her eyes had been wandering for some while, up the great pillars and along the carved roof and over the trembling candles, the way a child's eyes will. And in her wandering she had found the young guardsman at his post, the one in the red coat who was shaking, and she had been watching him for some minutes with the grave, open attention that only children give, and now, and I think this is the thing that turned the whole morning, though it was the smallest thing of all, now, she leaned across to her mother, and she whispered something. I could not hear it. No one could. It was a child's whisper. But I saw the Queen bend her head to her daughter, and I saw her listen, and I saw her eyes follow the line of the little girls pointing, children point. The protocol has no power over a child of 8 toward Thomas Reed. And I saw the Queen's face change. I have wondered ever since what the child said. The Queen told me long after, when I had grown old enough and she had grown sorrowful enough that we could speak plainly to one another about that day. She told me the little princess had whispered, "Mama, why is the soldier so sad? Is he not allowed to be sad? Everybody else is allowed." And the Queen, who had spent the whole rite holding her own grief behind a queen's stillness, who had stood at the lectern, and said aloud that the old man had been a father to the fatherless of the house, looked where her daughter pointed and saw, all at once, a young man of the household who was plainly one of the dead man's gathered children, plainly grieving a father, and plainly forbidden to show it, and the question her own small daughter had asked landed in her like a blade. Is he not allowed to be sad? Everybody else is allowed. The Queen told me, too, that in that moment she felt the old man very near. She said it was as though Halric Mowbray had leaned over her shoulder, the way he had leaned over her shoulder at 100 councils when she did not know what to do, and asked her his oldest question, the question he had asked her since she was 6 years old, every time the court wanted one thing and her conscience another. He used to phrase it always the same way, she said. He would lean down and murmur so only she could hear, "And what does the kindest thing look like here, little one? Not the correct thing, not the easy thing, the kindest thing. Find that and you will rarely be far wrong." 40 years he had asked her that, and she had built her whole reign on the asking, and now her daughter had asked the child's version of the very same question, is he not allowed to be sad? And the Queen understood, sitting in that pew with a small warm hand in each of hers, that the kindest thing and the correct thing were about to stand on opposite sides of the cathedral, and that she would have to choose between them in front of the whole realm, and that the old man who had taught her how to choose was lying dead in the box 3 steps from the trembling boy. She told me she very nearly wept then, not for the old man, but at the size of what he had left her to do without him. On the very first morning she had to do it without him. And then, she said, she lifted her chin, because that was the other thing he had taught her, and she began quietly to make up her mind. That was the first thing, the child's question and the Queen's beginning to turn. The second thing was Captain Greer, 6 steps off now and closing. And the third thing was Thomas Reed himself, who chose that moment perhaps because he heard the captain's step behind him, perhaps because the holding had simply reached its limit, perhaps because he had decided it in the cold dawn and was only waiting for the courage to move. He did not move the way a man breaks. That is the thing I most want you to understand, because it is the thing that made all the difference, the hair's breadth between disgrace and glory. A man who breaks at a funeral crumples, he sobs, he loses his bearing, he becomes a thing to be removed. Thomas Reed did not crumple. What he did with the full and terrible dignity of a man performing an act he has chosen, an act he has perhaps rehearsed in his heart through 100 sleepless nights, an act of will as great as the holding had been greater. He came to attention first. A clean, crisp snap to attention, the rifle correct, the heels together, so sharp and so perfect that for half a heartbeat I thought he had mastered himself and would hold after all. And then, having come to attention, having made himself, for one last instant, the perfect guardsman, the very image of the discipline he was about to set aside, he executed a slow, deliberate right turn off his post to face the coffin. A turn off post, the first broken protocol and on its own enough to end a guardsman's career. I heard the rustle go through the cathedral, the indrawn breath of hundreds of people who understood, even those who knew nothing of our rules, that something was wrong, that the statue had moved. I felt Captain Greer freeze in mid-step. I felt the Earl Marshal half rise in his pew. And I felt my own heart stop, because I knew that whatever Thomas Reed was about to do, there was no stopping it now and no taking it back, and that his whole life had just turned on the heel of that slow, deliberate turn. He faced the coffin. The trembling was gone. That is the strangest thing and the truest, and every man who stood near enough to see it has remarked on it since. The moment he stopped holding, the moment he turned and faced the thing he loved, the trembling left him entirely, and a great stillness came over him, a stillness deeper than any the discipline had ever given him. The stillness, I think, of a man who has stopped fighting himself and come home to what he is. He stood facing the coffin of the High Steward, perfectly still, perfectly composed, and the whole vast cathedral held its breath and waited to see what the young guardsman would do. And the captain, 6 steps away, did not move, and the Earl Marshal, half risen, did not speak, because there is a thing that happens very rarely in a great public moment, when a man does something so plainly outside the rules and so plainly right that the rules themselves seem, for a moment, to lose their grip, when the watchers feel, all at once and without words, that to interfere would be the true offense. It does not happen often. The institution almost always wins. But for the space of a few heartbeats, in Saint Aldous Cathedral, on the gray morning of the High Steward's funeral, it happened, and no man moved to stop Thomas Reed. And into that held silence, the young guardsman did the thing I will remember to the last day of my life. He went down on one knee. Slowly, with a guardsman's control, the rifle grounded just so, the bearskin level, the whole movement as clean and as deliberate as a man laying down the most precious thing he owns. He knelt on the cold stone before the coffin of the High Steward, in the post of honor, in front of the Queen and the court and the whole watching realm, and the kneeling was the second broken protocol, the deeper one, for the guard does not kneel in that cathedral. Only the crown kneels there, before God. The black book is plainer on the kneeling than on anything else. And I heard the whole cathedral take its breath at the sight of the red-coated guardsman down on his knee before the coffin, and I felt the air go tight as a drawn string. And then he did the thing that no protocol in the world has a page for, the thing that turned a broken rule into the most honored act anyone in that cathedral had ever witnessed. He took off his glove. He drew the white glove from his right hand, finger by finger, the way you would uncover your hand to touch something holy. Because a guardsman's gloved hand is part of the uniform, part of the discipline. The bare hand is the man himself. and Tomas Reed was setting the uniform aside for one moment to come to the coffin not as a guardsman but as a son. And he laid his bare right hand flat upon the lid of the coffin, over the place where the old man's heart would be, between the white staff and the folded gray cloak, and he bowed his head over his own hand. And in the great silence, in a voice that was low but that carried in the way that a true thing carries, in the way that the Queen's broken word had carried, Tomas Reed spoke to the dead. "You walked me across the cold," he said. "You told me I was not so alone as I thought. I was a kitchen boy weeping in the dark, and you stopped for me, my lord, you who had stood at the foot of 3 thrones. You stopped for a scullion in the night, and you walked me to the gate, and you told me grief was a thing you carry and not a thing you get over. I have carried it. I carry it now. And I could not let them carry you home without one of your children kneeling to say it. Thank you. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for the night you saw me. You said there were more of us out walking in the cold than I would guess. There were. We are all here, my lord, every one of us you ever stopped for. We are all here, and we will none of us forget the night you stopped." And he lifted his bare hand from the coffin, and he pressed it for one moment over his own heart, the old gesture, the soldier's gesture, the hand over the heart that means I carry you here now, and he bowed his head a last time, and he was still. I will not tell you that the cathedral wept, because that is a small word for what happened in Saint Aldous in those moments, and because half the power of it was that it happened in silence. The Queen wept. I saw it. She made no move to hide it now. The tears went down her still face, and she let them, and her hand had gone tight around her small daughter's hand. The old duchess in the nearest pew wept openly into her black glove. The great lords of the realm, men who had not wept in 40 years, stood with their faces working. The river men and the wool men at the back, the hard men who had bowed their heads for Halric Mowbray, wept without shame. The dean at the head of the coffin had bowed his own old head, and his lips were moving in something that was half a prayer and half a sob. Even the captain, 6 steps off, frozen where the moment had caught him, even Captain Greer, that hard old soldier, had a wet track down the side of his face that he did not wipe. And I who should have stopped him, I who by every regulation in the Black Book should have stepped from my place and relieved him the instant he turned off his post. I stood 3 paces away, and I let the tears come down my own face for the first time in 40 years, since the day I held my post over Sergeant Brand's coffin and did not kneel, and have regretted it ever since. Because Tomas Reed had done the thing I should have done over my own father's coffin and was too disciplined and too afraid to do. He had let the love outrank the protocol. He had found the page the Black Book does not have, and he had written it, kneeling, in the only ink a man has, which is his own courage. And watching him, I felt 40 years of held grief break loose in me all at once, and I did not fight it, and I have never since been ashamed that I did not. That is the thing Tomas Reed did. That is the act of honor that broke the protocol and stunned the cathedral and the court. If this were a smaller story, it would end there, on the kneeling guardsman and the weeping queen and the held breath of the realm, and you would close the book satisfied. But it does not end there, because a thing can be beautiful and still be against the rules, and the rules, when they recover from their surprise, do not forgive beauty. The institution had been held for a few heartbeats by the sheer rightness of what it saw, but institutions do not stay held. They recover. They remember themselves. And the man whose whole office and whole soul was the keeping of the protocols was already on his feet. Lord Corwin Hale, Earl Marshal of the realm, rose from his pew. His face was not weeping. His face was white and hard and certain, the face of a man who has watched the great clock of his perfect right slip its tooth at last, and who means to set it right whatever the cost. And he spoke, not loudly, but in the clear carrying voice of a man accustomed to command in great rooms, into the weeping silence of the cathedral, the first words anyone had spoken since the young guardsman fell silent over the coffin. "Captain," said the Earl Marshal, "remove that man. He has profaned the right of the High Steward, and he will answer for it. Remove him now." The word profaned went through the cathedral like cold water. It was the wrong word. Every weeping heart in that great room knew it was the wrong word. But it was the word the protocol would use, and the Earl Marshal had the right to use it, and that was the terror of the moment. Because Lord Corwin Hale was not, I have come to believe, a cruel man. He was something more dangerous than a cruel man at a funeral. He was a correct one. He had governed the High Steward's right with all the care a man can give to the thing he loves, and the thing he loved was the order itself, the perfect unbroken form, and he saw in Thomas Reed's kneeling not a son's love but a soldier's breach. A stone dropped in his clear water, and his whole soul recoiled from it. He believed, and I think he believed it sincerely, which is what made him so hard to hate and so hard to stop, that to let the breach stand was to dishonor the old man more than the kneeling honored him, that the High Steward of all men, the keeper of the realm's forms for 90 years, would not have wanted his right broken, that the kindest and truest thing was to remove the offending guardsman swiftly and let the great clean machine of the funeral resume. He was wrong, but he was not wrong in a way you could simply shout down, and he had the authority of his office, and the captain must obey him. Captain Greer had been frozen 6 steps from the kneeling guardsman. Now the Earl Marshal's order fell on him, and I watched my captain's face go through a war I have only seen a few times in a long life. The war of a good soldier given an order he knows in his bones is wrong, who has built his whole self on obedience, and now finds obedience pointing him at a thing his honor cannot bear. Captain Greer loved the old High Steward. Captain Greer had wept 6 steps away at the kneeling. And Captain Greer had spent 40 years learning that a soldier obeys, that the chain of command is the spine of the household, that the day a captain decides which lawful orders to follow is the day the whole structure begins to rot. The Earl Marshal's order was lawful. It came from the man whose office governs the ceremony. To refuse it in the cathedral before the court was a thing nearly as great as what Thomas Reed had done, and it would not be a son's beautiful gesture. It would be plain mutiny, the captain of the guard defying the Earl Marshal at a state funeral, and it could bring down not only Captain Greer but the standing of the whole household. I saw all of that cross my captain's face in the space of a breath, and then I saw him decide, and my heart went into my throat, because I saw him decide to obey. He took a step toward Thomas Reed. And here is the false dawn, the cruel turn, the moment the whole thing nearly went the wrong way and the beauty was nearly trampled by the correctness. For it looked, in that instant, as though the institution would win after all. As though the kneeling would be answered not with honor but with a hand on the elbow and a quiet march to the door. The son led away from the father's coffin as a man who had failed. The breach closed, the clock set turning again, and the whole shining moment ground back down into a disciplined matter, a thing for the black book and the orderly room. I have seen the institution win 100 times. It almost always wins. The reasonable, correct, well-meaning machinery grinds the beautiful exception down because that is what machinery does, and the world calls it order. And most of the time the world is even right too. I felt it coming. I felt the moment tipping toward the cold, correct ending, and I felt my own old helplessness, and I will tell you the truth. I very nearly did nothing again, the way I had done nothing over my own sergeant's grave, because 40 years of discipline is a hard thing to set down even when your heart is breaking. But I had set down my discipline once already that morning. I had let my tears fall at my post, which is itself against the book, and a man who has broken one rule out of love finds the second easier. And Thomas Reed was my boy. I had trained him. I had given him the post of honor that put him 3 steps from his father's coffin, not knowing what I did. If the institution was going to grind him down, it would have to come through his sergeant first. I stepped out of the line. It is a small thing to write, and it was the hardest single step of my life. 40 years I had stood in that line and never broken it. I stepped out of it now, 1 pace, and I turned, and I put myself between Captain Greer and the kneeling guardsman, and I came to attention before my own captain, and I said quietly but clear enough for the Earl Marshal to hear, because I meant him to hear it, "Sir, with respect, let me relieve this man, he's mine. I trained him. Whatever he answers for, let me be the one to take him from his post, and let it be done as a relief and not as an arrest here before the old lord he loved. That much I ask, as his sergeant, for the honor of the detail." It was not defiance. I was careful that it should not be defiance. I had no right to defy the Earl Marshal, and I knew it, and a sergeant who turns the captain's order into a mutiny does the household no service. It was a smaller thing, and I hoped, a wiser one. I was offering to do the very thing the order required, to remove the guardsman from his post, but to do it with my own hands, gently, as one soldier relieving another, so that the moment would not be stamped as a disgrace before the whole realm. I was trying to find the narrow path between the duty and the love, the path I had not found over my own father's grave. I was trying to give Thomas Reed what I had not given myself, a way to leave the coffin with his honor whole. The Earl Marshal looked at me. His white, hard face turned on me the full cold weight of his office, and for a moment I thought he would refuse, would order me back to the line and have Captain Greer drag the boy out by the arm and make the disgrace complete. I have faced down armed men with less fear than I faced the eyes of Lord Corwin Hale in that cathedral. I held his look. I did not look away. I had stepped out of the line, and there was no stepping back into it now. And so I stood, an old sergeant in a red coat with tears not yet dry on his face, between the cold, correct machinery of the realm and the kneeling boy who had done the bravest and most loving thing I had ever seen. And I waited to learn whether 40 years of service had bought me the right to be heard. And then a thing happened that I had not looked for, and that I think turned the Earl Marshal's mind as much as anything the Queen would say. Because it was one thing for an old sergeant to step out of his line. Old men are allowed their breeches. The realm forgives gray hair what it would not forgive youth. But 4 places down the line, the young guardsman Wat Alney, 2 years in the service, with everything before him and nothing behind him to protect him, came to attention with a snap I heard across the whole nave, and he executed a right turn off his own post, and he faced the coffin, and he grounded his rifle, and he stood there not kneeling. He did not presume to the kneel, that was Thomas's, and he knew it, but plainly, deliberately, breaking his post in solidarity with the man he loved. So that if the Earl Marshal meant to ruin one guardsman for honoring the old lord, he would have to ruin 2. And then, down the line, a 3rd man turned, and a 4th. Not all of them most held their posts, as they had been trained to, as was right, but 5 of the young guardsmen of that detail, one after another, came to attention and turned off their posts to face the coffin, ranging themselves in the breach beside Thomas Reed, until there was a little line of red-coated men standing turned toward the dead lord in plain defiance of the protocol. The young ones, the ones the old man's kindness had reached, declaring with their bodies that whatever Thomas Reed was to answer for, they would answer for it with him. I have served 40 years, and I had never seen the like, and I never saw it again. It was not mutiny. Not one of them spoke. Not one laid a hand on anything. Not one stepped toward the Earl Marshal. They only turned and stood and faced the coffin, and let the consequence fall where it would. It was the household rallying, not the great machine of the household with its convoys and its units, but the truer thing under the machine, the loyalty of young men to an old man who had been kind to them, and to a friend who had dared to say so. And I watched the Earl Marshal look down that little line of turned guardsmen, the boy Wat Alney white-faced and trembling and unmoving in the breach, and I watched something go out of Lord Corwin Hale's certainty, because a man can call one breach a profanation, and order it removed, but when half the young men of his honor detail turn as one and stand in the breach beside it, he is no longer looking at a fault in the works. He is looking at the heart of his own institution, telling him plainly that he has misread the day. And it was then into that frozen standoff, the Earl Marshal on his feet, the captain caught between his orders, the old sergeant out of his line, the boy on his knee at the coffin, and the whole weeping cathedral holding its breath, that a chair scraped softly in the front pew, and a clear, quiet voice, a voice that every man and woman in that cathedral would have known in the dark, said one word. No. And Queen Saralind rose to her feet. A queen rising in a cathedral is a thing that changes the air. The whole court came half to its feet by instinct and then checked itself, unsure, because there is no protocol for what to do when the sovereign stands in the middle of a funeral she is not conducting. The Earl Marshal turned to her, and I saw the certainty in his face waver for the first time, because the one authority in that cathedral greater than the Earl Marshal's over the right is the crown's over everything, and he did not yet know what the crown would say. She did not say it at once. She came forward out of the front pew, past her startled children, the prince consort half rising to attend her, and then sitting again at the small movement of her hand. She came forward into the open space before the catafalque, into the cold silver light, the Queen of Eldermoor in her dark mourning, and she stopped beside the kneeling guardsman. She looked down at him, at the bare hand he had pressed to his heart, at the white glove still in his other hand, at the bowed head under the bearskin. And then she looked up, and she looked first at the Earl Marshal, and then slowly around the whole great weeping cathedral, the court and the ministers and the guildsmen and the servants and the old women who had been girls when the dead man was already old, and she spoke so that all of them could hear. "My Lord Earl Marshal," she said, "you have governed this rite with great care, and I thank you for it. You have kept every form. And you are right that the forms matter. They matter more than most men know. The old lord we bury today spent 90 years keeping them, and I will not have it said that his queen holds the forms cheap." She let that stand a moment, and I saw the Earl Marshal's chin lift a little, thinking he was vindicated. And then she said, "But you have made one error, my lord, and it is the error a keeper of forms is most apt to make, and it is this: you have mistaken the form for the thing the form was made to serve." The cathedral was utterly silent now. Even the weeping had hushed to hear her. "Why does the guard not kneel in this place?" the Queen said. "You know the rule, my lord, you keep it, but do you know the reason under it? The reason is that this is the house of God and the crown, and the kneeling here is reserved, so that the realm sees clearly who serves whom and who is served above all. That is a good rule. It guards against a soldier making a show of himself, against the post becoming a stage, against grief turned into spectacle. It is a wall built to keep something precious safe." She looked down again at Thomas Reed. "But a wall is built to keep a thing safe, my lord, not to keep it out. And tell me, what did this man make of himself just now? A show, a spectacle. Look at him. Look at all of you who are weeping. Did this man turn his post into a stage for himself? Or did he, alone of all of us, find the one true thing this whole great rite was built to say, and say it with his bare hand on the coffin, when the rest of us could only sit in our forms and our furs and watch?" No one answered. No one needed to. "I stood at that lectern," the Queen said, and her voice dropped and went rough again, "and I told you all that the High Steward gathered up the lost children of this house all his long life and made them his own and asked nothing back. I told you it was his secret life, the one the histories would not record. And then the histories nearly did not record it after all, because when one of those very children, the last of them perhaps, knelt down at his coffin to say in front of the whole realm what the rest of us were too well trained to say, the keeper of the forms called it a profanation and ordered him dragged out the door. She turned the full weight of her grief and her sovereignty on the Earl Marshal, and it was a terrible and a quiet thing. No, my lord. The profanation would have been to let him be dragged out. The profanation would have been to bury the old man in perfect silence and let no one say aloud what he was. This guardsman has not broken the rite. He has completed it. He has given my eulogy its proof. And I will not have him touched. I have served the crown 40 years, and I have heard the Queen speak in council and in court and at the head of armies, and I never heard her speak as she spoke in Saint Aldous that morning. The Earl Marshal stood with his white face and his keeping of forms, and I watched the certainty go out of him. Not all at once, for such men do not surrender all at once, but I watched the order he served and the truth he had missed change places in his eyes, and I watched him understand, slowly and against his whole nature, that he had been right about the rule and wrong about everything that mattered. And I thought it was over. I thought the Queen had spoken and the boy was safe and the moment was won. That is what I thought, and that is what every soul in the cathedral thought, and it would have been a good ending, and it was not the ending. Because Thomas Reed lifted his head. He had knelt silent through all of it, through the Earl Marshal's order, through my stepping out of the line, through the Queen's rising and her speech. He had said his piece to the old man and bowed his head and meant, I think, to stay bowed, to take whatever came, to accept his arrest or his relief or his ruin as the price of the thing he had chosen, and to make no further trouble. He was not a man who wanted a scene. He had done what he came to do. But now he lifted his head, and he looked up at the Queen standing over him, and I saw on his young face something that frightened me more than the Earl Marshal's order had, because I saw that he had something more to say, and that he was going to say it, and that it might undo everything she had just won for him. "Your Majesty," he said, "forgive me, but I cannot let you save me by half a truth." The cathedral, which had begun to breathe again, stopped breathing. "You are kind to call what I did the completing of the rite," Thomas Reed said, "and I would give a great deal to leave it there and walk out of this place forgiven. But I knew the rule when I broke it. I knew the post does not kneel. I knew the glove does not come off. I knew what it would cost, and I broke it anyway with my eyes open, and if I let you tell the realm I did no wrong, then I make a lie of the only true thing I have ever done. I did wrong, Your Majesty. By the black book of my service, I did a great wrong, and I will not pretend otherwise, not even to save myself, not even at your own bidding. I broke my oath of the post. And a man who will not stand to the cost of what he chose has not really chosen it at all." And he reached up slowly, and he took off his bearskin, the third broken protocol, the uncovering of the head, a guardsman bareheaded at his post, the deepest unmaking of the uniform there is, and he held it against his chest, the way a common man holds his cap at a graveside, and he said to the Queen and to the Earl Marshal and to the whole watching realm, "I am ready to answer for it. I only ask to answer for it honestly. Do not call it no wrong. Call it what it was, a man who loved his father more than his oath on the one day it could not be helped, and then do with me what the law of my service requires. That is all I ask. Let the rule stand. Let me stand under it. I would not dishonor the old Lord by pretending his rules do not matter. I broke one of them. Now let it cost what it costs." I have thought about that speech more than about anything else that was said in the cathedral that day, more even than the Queen's, because the Queen's words were the words of a great soul forgiving, but Thomas Reed's were the words of a greater one refusing to be forgiven cheaply, and there is a kind of honor in that which is rarer and harder than any other. He had just been handed his pardon by the sovereign herself, in front of the whole realm. All he had to do was bow his head and accept it and walk out a hero, and instead he gave it back. He gave it back because to take it would have been to say that rules are only for ordinary men, that love excuses a soldier from his oath, that a beautiful breach is no breach at all, and Thomas Reed, who had broken the rule out of love, would not let the rule be cheapened even to save himself, because he honored the rule too, and the man who had kept the rules for 90 years, and he would not buy his own safety with the coin of pretending the old Lord's whole life's work did not matter. It is a strange thing to say, but in that moment the bare-headed boy kneeling at the coffin was the most disciplined man in the cathedral. He had broken the protocol and then defended it. He had set down the form to serve the thing it served, and then he had stood the form back up and put himself under it. There is no contradiction in that, though it took me years to see it whole. The rule is good. The breach was right. And a man of honor holds both of those truths at once and pays the price of the second without pretending away the first. That is the thing the Earl Marshal had never understood, and the thing the Queen understood, and the thing that Thomas Reed, 22 years old and bareheaded at his father's coffin, taught the whole court of Eldermoor in a single sentence. The Queen looked down at him for a long moment, and then, and I will remember the small, sad smile that came to her face as long as I remember anything, she said, "Of course you will not let me. He taught you too well. He taught all his children to stand to the cost of what they chose. It is the first thing he ever taught me." She drew a breath. "Very well, I will not pretend you did no wrong. You ask me to let the rule stand, and you are right, and I will let it stand. The guard does not kneel in this place. You knelt. That is a breach of the protocol of your service, and it must be answered, and I will not insult you or the old lord by waving it away." I felt the cold come back into my chest, because she was agreeing with him. She was going to let it cost. "It must be answered," the Queen said again, "and so I will answer it, here, now, as is my right." And she turned to the Earl Marshal. "My lord, what is the penalty in the Black Book of the household for a guardsman who breaks his post and kneels at a state right?" The Earl Marshal, who knew every page of every protocol, who had been white and certain and was now something else, something shaken and searching, answered her honestly, because he was at bottom an honest man. "The penalty, your majesty, is dismissal from the service, with the lesser penalty at the discretion of the crown of reduction and confinement where there are grounds for mercy." "Dismissal," the Queen said, "or reduction and confinement at the discretion of the crown, the discretion of the crown." She let the words hang. "I am the crown, and I will exercise the discretion. Hear me, all of you, for I will make this a matter of record, and I want no man to say afterward that the Queen set the rules aside on a whim of grief." She stood very straight and she lifted her chin, and I saw that she lifted it the way the old man had taught her, 60 years gone, a frightened girl on a throne too big for her, and she gave her judgment. "It is true that you broke your post," she said to Thomas Reed, "and it is true that the breach must be answered, and you are right to insist on it, and I honor you for the insisting. So I will answer it. I find that you did break the protocol of your service. And I find that you broke it in the performance of a higher duty than the protocol, the duty of a son to a father, the duty of the household to the man who gathered its lost ones up, the duty of the realm to speak aloud, at least once, the truth of what it has lost. The Black Book of the household has a page for the breaking of a post. It does not have a page for what you did, because what you did has not been done before, and so I will write the page myself here, as is the right of the crown that the book serves." She turned to the dean, and to the clerks who keep the record of state rights, and she spoke for the record. "Let it be written that on this day, at the funeral of Lord Halric Mowbray, High Steward of the realm, a guardsman of the household foot broke his post and knelt at the coffin, in breach of the protocol of his service. Let it be written that the breach was real and was not waved away. And let it be written that the crown, exercising its discretion, judged the breach to have been done in honor and not in fault, and answered it not with dismissal, nor with reduction, nor with confinement, but with this: that the guardsman's act is entered into the records of the household as the steward's kneel, and that henceforth, at the funeral of any servant of the crown who is judged by the sovereign to have been, as Lord Mowbray was, a father or a mother to the people of this house, one guardsman of the detail and one only may, if he chooses and if he means it truly, break his post and kneel and lay his bare hand upon the coffin and speak, not as a license, not as a show, but as the household's right to grieve its own, so that no child of this house need ever again hold his love behind his oath at the last. Let it be the old lord's last gift to the guard, the page he would have written himself, had he known it was needed. Let it bear his name. I do not have the words for what went through the cathedral then. I have tried in the years since, and I have not found them. The Queen had taken the boy's breach, which the Earl Marshal had called a profanation, and she had not excused it and she had not punished it. She had made it law. She had turned the worst day of Thomas Reed's life into the founding of a thing that would outlast every soul in that cathedral. A small door cut into the great wall of the protocol, forever, so that love would always have a way through at the end. She had given the old man who had gathered the lost ones all his life, one last lost one to gather, the future, all the grieving children of the house not yet born, and she had given the guard, my hard and disciplined and beloved guard, a thing it had never had, permission, just once at the right grave, to be human out loud. And I looked at the Earl Marshal, because I am a soldier, and a soldier watches the man whose mind has been changed against his will, to see whether the change will hold. And I saw Lord Corwin Hale, keeper of the forms, do a thing I had not thought him capable of. I saw him come forward. Slowly, stiffly, like a man walking against a wind, he came forward to the catafalque, and he stood over the kneeling guardsmen, and the whole cathedral tensed, not knowing what he would do. And the Earl Marshal looked down at Thomas Reed for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice gone low and not at all certain, the voice of a man saying a thing it costs him everything to say, "I called it a profanation. I was wrong. I have kept the forms of this realm for 30 years, and I told myself I kept them out of love, and perhaps I did, but I had forgotten what I loved them for. You remembered." A boy of the kitchens remembered what the Earl Marshal forgot. And then, and at this the old Duchess in the front pew gave a sob that she could not hold. The Earl Marshal of the realm, the keeper of all the protocols, drew off his own glove, and he laid his own bare hand upon the coffin beside the place where the guardsmen's had been, and he bowed his head, and he stood so, a moment, beside the kneeling boy. The highest keeper of the forms and the lowest breaker of them, side by side at the old man's coffin, both bareheaded, both barehanded, both grieving the same father. Then the Earl Marshal straightened, and he turned to the captain, and he said, "Captain Greer, stand your detail easy. There will be no removal. The Crown has spoken, and the Crown is right, and I am content." And he went back to his pew, and he sat down, and he wept, the cold, correct man, into his bare hand like all the rest of us. And Thomas Reed, still kneeling, still bareheaded, looked up at the Queen, and the Queen looked down at the boy, and something passed between them that I think only the two of them and the dead man ever fully understood. The understanding of two of the old lord's gathered children, the highest and the lowest, who had both lifted their chins because he taught them to, and who would both now carry him in the quiet for the rest of their lives. And the Queen reached down, and she did a thing no protocol allows and no protocol forbids, because no one had ever thought to make a rule for it. She set her own hand for a moment on the young guardsman's bowed head, the old blessing touch a mother gives a child, and she said, so softly that only those of us nearest heard it, "He would be so proud of you. He is so proud of you. I felt him in the room the moment you knelt. Stand up now, child. Put on your bearskin. Finish the duty. He would want his guard at his post when they carry him out." And Thomas Reed stood up. He drew the white glove back onto his bare right hand, finger by finger, the reverse of the uncovering, the man becoming the guardsman again. He set the bearskin back upon his head and squared it. He bent and took up his grounded rifle. He came to attention, the clean, crisp snap of it, sharper than ever, and he executed the slow left turn back onto his post, and he stood once more on the right of the catafalque, eyes forward in the post of honor, the perfect, immovable guardsman, exactly as he had stood at the beginning. To a man walking in off the square that moment who had seen none of it, he would have looked like discipline made flesh, the statue at the coffin, unbroken and unbreakable. But every soul in that cathedral had seen it, and every soul knew that the stillness they were looking at now was a different and a greater stillness than the one before, the stillness of a man who had broken and been remade, who had set the uniform down and taken it back up by choice, who stood his post now not because he could not move, but because, having moved when love required it, he chose to be still again for the sake of the duty he loved. That is the highest discipline there is. Not the stillness of a man who has never been tested, the stillness of a man who has been tested to the breaking and gone past it and come home. The queen returned to her pew and gathered her children, and the little princess looked up at her with a question on her small face, and the queen bent and whispered to her, and whatever she said, the little girl's face cleared, and she nodded, and she looked over at the guardsman at his post with the satisfied look of a child who has been told that yes, the soldier was allowed to be sad after all, and that everything is as it should be. And I have always thought that the little princess never knew, and perhaps still does not know to this day, that her single whispered question, "Is he not allowed to be sad? Everybody else is allowed," was the small stone that started the whole great avalanche, the thing that turned the queen's eyes to the trembling guardsman at the moment that mattered. The greatest things so often turn on the smallest, and the smallest hand in that whole vast cathedral set the greatest thing in motion. The old man would have liked that. He had always known the small ones were where the kingdom truly lived. The dean came forward and finished the rite, and it was a different rite now in the second half than it had been in the first. In the first half it had been a perfect machine, grand and cold and correct, the great clock turning. In the second half it was something the protocol had never planned for and could not have made. It was true. The remaining commendations were laid on the coffin by lords who no longer cared whether their faces were composed, because the Earl Marshal himself had wept into his bare hand, and so what use was composure now? The choir sang the last hymn, and the cathedral sang with it, the whole vast crowd, the lords and the guildsmen and the servants and the old women, all of them together, and it was not a perfect sound. It cracked and wavered the way a sound made of 1,000 grieving throats will, and it was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard under that ancient roof. The forms held. The rite was kept. But the thing the forms were made to serve had come up through them at last like water through stone, and the keeping and the truth were one thing now, the way they are meant to be, the way they so rarely are. And then it was time to carry the old man home. The 6 pallbearers took up the coffin onto their shoulders. The white staff laid the length of the lid, the gray cloak folded at the foot, and they turned it down the long center aisle toward the great west doors and the cold square beyond, where the bier and the slow black horses waited to carry the High Steward to his rest in the crypt of his fathers. And the detail came to present arms, the whole 30 and more of us, the slow grand salute of the household to the dead, and we held it as the coffin passed, the rifles up, the white gloves bright, the line perfect. And as the coffin came level with Thomas Reed at his post, the boy presented arms with the rest, eyes forward flawless, the perfect guardsman saluting the dead lord one last time. But I, who stood 3 paces off and watched him, saw the one thing the rest of the cathedral did not. I saw that as the coffin passed him, Thomas Reed's eyes, fixed forward, were full and shining, and that he let them be. He did not blink the wet away. He did not fight it. He held his salute and his post in perfect form, and he let the tears stand in his eyes as the man who had walked him across the cold went by, and there was no shame in it and no breach in it, because the queen had cut the door in the wall, and the door would stand forever now. And a guardsman of the household could grieve his father at his post and still be a guardsman. He held his salute until the coffin passed under the great west doors and out into the gray light of the square, and the bell of Saint Aldous began again its slow tolling, and the High Steward of the realm went home. That is the funeral. That is the thing the realm remembers, the thing the criers were calling out in the streets before nightfall, and the thing that was told and retold in every guild hall and tavern and kitchen in Eldermoor for years after, the day the young guardsman knelt at the old lord's coffin and the queen made it law. But a funeral is only a mourning, and a life is longer than a mourning, and there are some threads of this story I have not yet tied off, and I will tie them now, because you have come this far with me and you deserve to know how it all came out. I will start with the Earl Marshal, because his is the change that surprised me most and that I have come to value most. I had marked Lord Corwin Hale that morning as the cold, correct machinery of the realm, And I had been right, and I had also been wrong, the way we are nearly always wrong when we mark a man down as one thing only. He was a keeper of forms who had forgotten what the forms were for, and the kneeling guardsman reminded him, and a lesser man would have hated the boy for the reminding, the way men hate the mirror that shows them what they have become. Lord Corwin Hale did not hate him. He did the rarer and harder thing. He learned. In the months after the funeral, it was the Earl Marshal himself, the very man who had ordered Thomas Reid dragged from the cathedral, who drew up the formal protocol of the steward's kneel, who wrote into the black book of the household the page the Queen had spoken into being, who set down the conditions of it and the dignity of it so that it could never become the cheap show he had feared. He made the door in the wall, and he made it well, and he made it strong, the keeper of forms putting all his great skill at the keeping of forms to the service of the one beautiful breach that had broken his heart open. I came to honor him for it more than I have honored almost any man. It is no great thing to be right from the start. It is a very great thing to be wrong in public, before the whole realm, and to turn and learn and spend the rest of your strength making the right thing permanent. The old High Steward, I think, would have valued Lord Corwin Hale's slow, hard change above almost anything else that came of that day, because the old man's whole life had been the patient turning of cold, correct things into warm, true ones, one frightened scullion at a time. I will tell you next about the Queen, though there is less to tell, because what she did in the cathedral was the whole of it, and she would not thank me for making more of her than that. But I will say this. She came some weeks after to the guardroom. She did not summon Thomas Reid to her. She came to him, to the plain, warm guardroom where the off-duty men drink their tea, which no reigning sovereign of Eldermoor had ever done before, and she sat with him on the bench by the brazier, the very kind of bench the old man had sat the weeping boy on a midnight years before, and she talked with him a long while, the two of them, the highest of the old lord's children and one of the lowest, and no one else heard what passed between them, and no one ever will. But Thomas told me after only one thing she had said, because it was a thing he wanted me to hear. She had said, "He used to tell me that the day the crown forgets the kitchen boy is the day the crown is not worth keeping." I had forgotten it. You reminded me. So we are even, you and I. You reminded your queen of the thing your old lord spent 90 years teaching her. He would call that a fair morning's work. And then she had risen, and at the door she had turned and said, "Lift your chin, guardsman, not for them, for yourself." Which was the old man's own line, the line he had given her on a throne too big for her 60 years gone, passed down now from the Queen to the kitchen boy, the way the true things are always passed down, hand to hand in the quiet, between the people who carry the same dead in their hearts. And now I will tell you about Thomas Reid, and then I will be done. He stayed in the service. He could have left it. After the funeral he could have had near anything he asked, and there were great houses that would have taken him into their own guard at 3 times his pay for the fame of him. He stayed. He stayed because the guard was his home, and the post was his calling, and the old man had taught him that a man's work is the company he keeps with the thing he loves, and Thomas Reid loved the service, even the hard, cold discipline of it, even the holding. He rose in the years after. He made corporal and then sergeant, and in time he stood where I had stood, training the green young men, teaching them the discipline, teaching them to be still. And I sat in on his teaching, once, near the end of my own years, an old man let into the warm to watch a younger one do the work, and I heard him tell a class of recruits the thing I had told him and that had been told to me, the small liturgy of our trade. We hold so that everyone else can break. And then I heard him add a thing I had never taught him, a thing that was wholly his own, a thing he had bought with his own grief at his own father's coffin, and I have made it part of my own teaching ever since. We hold so that everyone else can break, Thomas Reid told the recruits. That is the duty, and it is a true one, and you will give your lives to it and be right too. But hear me, because the black book will not tell you this, and I am the only sergeant in the household who will. There will come a day, one day perhaps, in a long service, perhaps never, but perhaps one day, when the thing you are holding for and the thing you love stand on opposite sides of you and pull you in half, and the protocol points one way and your honor points the other. And on that day, you must know that the discipline was never the master. The discipline was always the servant. We hold so that everyone else can break, but we hold for love, lads, for love of the crown and the realm and the people. And on the day the holding stops serving the love and starts betraying it, the love comes first, because the love was always the point, and the holding was only ever the way we kept it. A man who would not break his post to honor what he loves has not understood why we stand the post at all. Pray you never face that day. But if you do, if you ever do, break it cleanly, break it with honor, and stand to the cost. There is a door in the wall now. An old lord and a queen cut it, and a kitchen boy walked through it first. It will be there if you ever need it. Pray you never do, but it will be there. He never told them the kitchen boy was himself. I learned over the years that this was Thomas Reed all over. He had walked through the door first, before the whole realm, and then he spent the rest of his life pointing other men toward it without ever once standing in it again to take the credit. The fame of the funeral followed him always, of course. Men knew, but he never spoke of it as his own. He spoke of it as the old lord's gift and the queen's law, and of himself, when he spoke of himself at all, as only the man who happened to be standing in the post of honor on the morning the door got cut. I think the humility was real. I think a man who has knelt at the coffin of the one who saved him does not afterward have much appetite for being made into a hero. He had not done it to be a hero. He had done it because he loved an old man and could not let him go into the ground without saying so. The hero was a thing the realm made of him after, and he wore it lightly and set it down whenever he could, and went on standing his post. And I must not forget the young men who turned. Wat Alney and the 4 others who broke their posts and stood in the breach beside Thomas Reed, the household rallying in its truest and smallest form. They were not punished either, for the Queen's judgment covered them all. She said, when the Earl Marshal asked her how the others who had turned should be answered, that a man who breaks his post out of loyalty to a brother who broke his out of love has committed no crime the Crown will recognize, and that she would sooner have a guard that turns toward its own grief than one that stands frozen while its heart breaks. Wat Alney rose in the service too in the years after, and he never forgot that morning. And when he was an old man and I was older, he told me that turning off his post to stand beside Thomas had been the proudest act of his life, and that he had done it without thinking, the way you put your hand out to catch a falling thing, and that he had been terrified the whole time and would do it again 100 times over. The old lord had been kind to Wat Alney once, too. There was hardly a young soul in that palace he had not been kind to, and Wat had been paying it back, the only way a guardsman can, with his body in the breach. That is the thing the old man planted in all of them, all his long life. Not obedience, which any drill master can plant, but loyalty, which only kindness can, and which outlasts the man who plants it by a generation and more. I asked him once, we were old friends by then, the distance of rank long worn away between us. I asked him whether he had decided it in the cold dawn, the way I had always suspected, or whether it had come on him in the moment. And he was quiet a long while, and then he said, "Both, Sergeant. I decided it in the dawn. I knew when I heard he was dead that I could not stand at his coffin and hold. I knew I would kneel. I had known it for days, but I could not have done it. I would have held after all the way you held over your sergeant, the way we are trained to, the way almost every man does. I had decided it, and I still could not have done it." He looked at me. "It was the little princess that did it. I heard her, you know. I heard her whisper it, 'Is he not allowed to be sad?' I was 3 steps away. I heard the child ask whether the soldier was allowed to be sad, and something in me said, 'She is right.' She is 8 years old, and she has seen the whole thing more clearly than the whole court. He is allowed to be sad. The old man would be the first to say so. He stopped for me when I wept in the cold. He would not want me to hold over his coffin out of fear of the rules he kept. And the moment I thought that, I could do it. A child unlocked it, Sergeant. The smallest one in the room. He always said that was where the kingdom truly lived. He smiled, the small sad smile that the Queen had smiled too, the smile of all the old Lord's children. I think he sent her the question. I do not say it to anyone else because it sounds like an old soldier's fancy. But I think he was in the room, the way the Queen said, and I think he leaned down to the smallest one there, the way he always leaned down to the smallest, and he set the question in her mouth and pointed her at me. It would be exactly like him. To save one last lost child by way of another. That was his whole life. Why would his death be any different? I have no answer to that, and I have stopped looking for one. I am an old soldier, and I have seen too much to be certain of either the world we can touch or the one we cannot. I will only tell you that I have stood in Saint Aldous Cathedral many times since that gray morning, at many funerals, and the steward's kneel has been given a handful of times in the years between, always for one of the great-hearted servants of the crown, always by one guardsman, always with the full grave dignity that Lord Corwin Hale wrote into the protocol. And every single time, without fail, I have felt the same thing I felt the first time, the thing the boy described. The sense of the room being fuller than it looks, of more of us out walking in the cold than you would guess. I do not explain it, I only report it. The cathedral holds the old man's gift the way stone holds warmth after the sun is down, and the warmth has not gone out of it yet, and I do not think it will in my lifetime, or in the little princess's, or in her children's after her. As for me, Sergeant Edrin Vance, the man who should have stopped him and did not, I have made my peace with the thing I failed to do over my own sergeant's grave 40 years ago. I could not kneel for Sergeant Brand. The discipline held me. I have regretted it all my life. But I stepped out of the line for Tomas Reed. I stepped out of the line, the first time in 40 years, and put myself between the cold machinery and the kneeling boy, and asked to relieve him gently, for the honor of the detail. It was a smaller thing than what he did, I know that. I did not kneel, I did not break the post, I only stepped out and spoke. But it was the bravest thing I ever did in this uniform, and I did it for love. And when my own time comes and they carry me into Saint Aldous in a plain box with no white staff and no folded cloak, I will go into the ground knowing that once, on a gray morning when it counted, an old sergeant who had spent his whole life holding, finally learned from a kitchen boy that the holding was only ever the servant of the love, and that I stood up when it mattered, and I was not still. They asked me, when I grew too old for the post, and they moved me into the warm of the guardroom to talk to the recruits about honor, what I most wanted to tell the young men. The captains expected me to talk about discipline, about the stillness, about the long holding. And I do talk about those things because they are true and the service cannot stand without them. But the thing I most want to tell them, the thing I save for the end, when the room has gone quiet and a young man is listening with his whole heart, is the thing I learned 3 paces from a coffin on the gray morning we buried the High Steward of the realm. I tell them, be still, hold your post. Give the realm your stillness so the realm can break against you and be held. That is the duty, and it is a high one, and you will be proud to give your life to it. But never forget what the stillness is for. Never let it become the master. Because one day, pray it never comes, but one day, the thing you love may stand at a coffin and need you to kneel. And on that day, lads, the bravest and most disciplined thing a guardsman can do is to take off his glove and lay down his bare hand and let the realm see just once that the statue had a heart in it all along. That is what the kitchen boy taught the court of Eldermoor. That is the old lord's last gift. And that is the end of my story and of the longest, hardest and finest morning of my life in the service of the crown. Lift your chin, guardsmen, not for them, for yourself. And hold your post, until the day that love itself commands you just once to kneel.